This is Preti Kaur, and you're listening to Millennials Boleh, the show which is all about millennials. Hi, listeners. This is the very first episode of Millennials Boleh. My name is Preti, and I am an English language teacher at an international school in Malaysia. So the idea of creating a podcast for millennials came to me while I was on the school campus. And the aim of this podcast is really to discuss issues that affect millennials and possibly provide them with a platform to discuss and express their opinions on sort of issues that are sort of plaguing their lives at the moment. So for this very first episode, I have none other than my sister, Parveen Kaur, that is joining us for this episode. So Parveen, would you like to give us a bit of a background on you?
Hi everyone, my name is Parveen Kaur, and I guess the background of me is that I am right now a young millennial lawyer, struggling as every other young millennial lawyer would be, and what I do is litigation and dispute resolution work presently. Aside from that, I actually do write on occasion about things that affect me and issues that plague me as a millennial, I suppose. So that's my background. And aside from that, I also enjoy reading people like Orwell, which I think are writers that gave a platform to liberals. And I believe that millennials are very much liberals. But that's just my opinion.
Thank you for that. And I think for the first episode, it's really important for us, I think, to go into what it means to be a millennial. Where did the label millennial sort of came from, and I think just to sort of unpack what it means to be a millennial in Malaysia as well. All right, okay, so we're going to start with that.
Okay, Preti. So since you're the brainchild of this podcast, why don't you tell us what it means to be a millennial, or maybe just really start with what is a millennial?
Right, I think that's a very good question, and it's definitely a starting point for this episode.
We did discuss prior to
yeah,
this.
no, obviously with everything there's great preparation that goes into
Great preparation
that goes into things like this. Right, so if we look at the term millennial and where it sort of came to be, the general consensus is that the millennial generation label originated from William Strauss and Neil Hove's 1991 book titled Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069. So this was the book that first sort of used the term or the label millennials.
It's interesting that you use the word label. Why do you use the word label? As far as I know, you being a teacher, you've always said that, never use labels for anyone, even for you, the word intelligent is a label. So why is millennial a label here? Why is it millennial just a term to sort of describe a sector of society? How come that's the case? Pretty.
I think when it comes to labels in general, and if we go back, if we're talking about sociology here and the labeling theory, I think labels are generally used to compartmentalize certain groups of society. And I think through compartmentalizing them, we start learning and understanding about that group of people. So I disagree generally. That's my philosophy, is that we should not be using labels, and we should have expectations that are equal for every group. But at the same time, I do understand the reason that goes behind labeling, just like the term millennials.
So aside from the societal aspect and, we're looking at numbers here, 1980s to 1990s. These are the years that millennials are born in. Aside from that, can we also shorten it to a sense that millennials are children of baby boomers? Can we say that?
I think we could definitely say that. I think if you look at just like what you mentioned, the time frame, so it refers to people born between the early 1990s and the early I guess I should have gone with 1980s first, but between the early 1980s to the early 1990s. And I think referring to that itself, it definitely refers to children of baby boomers. And what about if we go back to our origin, So how old is our mum?
I think you could say that our mom is a baby boomer, born in the 1960s, early 1960s. So we are children of baby boomers, which I think is really, it's almost ironic because baby boomers are the ones who are the most critical of millennials. So basically, it's a generation that birthed millennials who are the most critical of millennials. I've always found that kind of interesting in
Yeah.
a sad sort of way. You know?
Yeah. I think that's actually a very interesting discussion, and we're actually going to go into that
Obviously.
very soon. But before that, before we can go into sort of the perception that society has on millennials, can we both now describe um, how we feel about being a millennial? How would you describe being a millennial, Parveen, in your opinion?
Generally, or are you talking about being a millennial in this fine country that we live in?
I think let's start with generally, and
Okay.
let's slowly go into what it means to be a millennial in this country.
Okay. So I guess what it means to be a millennial for me would be that it means that we have to deal with being young and being sort of to a degree the in a sense the scapegoats for everything that goes wrong. But generally I am sort of a pessimist, so bear with me for the first half of this explanation about what it means to be a millennial. So generally I feel we are sort of the scapegoats, so whatever that goes wrong in society, whatever that people are dissatisfied with in society, millennials are always the go-to to be the victim of, this is what's wrong with the country, this is what's wrong with society today. Millennials, they're lazy, they're inclined to not go to work, they're the sort of generation to quit in a day, they're the sort of generation to not work hard enough. Baby boomers worked much harder in their time, but it's not really true, is it? When you look at statistics, that's not really the case. But this is what I feel being millennial means. Aside from that, I think what being millennial means is that we are able to sort of express our ideas much more liberally. And I think being a millennial means that we are a changed sort of generation. We're not a generation that was like our predecessors. We don't have like that traditional mindset to things. We don't believe that there is a set way of living a life. We sort of do things the way that we sort of get satisfied. I feel like a lot of millennials are always sort of looking for satisfaction and happiness, and there's always a goal in their mind. Like when you look at societies like the UK, even when you look at politics, even it always goes back to it's a very different climate that we live in now because of millennials, I feel. So I'm not saying that millennials are the generation that is sort of better than their predecessors. But what I'm saying is that, we are a different society. We are a society that is comfortable with media. We're a society that is comfortable with the internet. And although there's a perception that millennials don't read enough and don't take enough interest in what happens, I actually think it's the complete opposite. I think millennials are people who are very interested in what's happening in the world and very affected by their surroundings. They're not so much very selfish in that sense.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. A lot of these things that you're saying, the ones that are saying it are probably not millennials themselves, is it? It's the rest of the makeup of society, which probably comprises of the baby boomers and the generation that came before that. And I think one of the reasons, and I think in every society and perhaps in every generation, even the generation that comes after millennials, we are going to be critical of the new generation because it sort of, the new generation will always sort of go against the grain that we have created in a sense. So I guess in a sense, what we're trying to say here is that, the negative perception of millennials come from the generation that comes before them.
Because change is always unwelcome, isn't it? To a degree.
But change is also necessary.
Yeah. No, we are saying that change is necessary, but change is unwelcome. That's why when you look at, even in the 1980s, when you talk about Gen Xs, there's this famous movie with Winona Ryder and Ethan Hawke, I think. I haven't actually watched it, but that was sort of the epitome of that century, Gen Xs are going out in the world, and they're a society that are maligned by their predecessors. And I think it's the same thing again now with millennials.
Yeah.
But keeping in mind that millennials, sort of that frame of who is a millennial is sort of quite wide, as opposed to when we used to define it as Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z. Millennials sort of encompass a larger sort of network of
Yeah.
individuals.
I think so too. I think, and I think even because of that, the range of personalities that you get from this group is also quite different. I think if we look at Generation Z in comparison to Generation Y, and possibly even the generation that comes after Generation Z, the ones who are born in the early 2000s, there's lots of difference in that range as well. And I think we perhaps probably fall into Generation Y, encroaching into Generation Z. So I think our personality will be quite different from the generation of the early 2000s as well. But I think regardless of all of this, what it tells me about the millennials is that, or this generation is in particular, is that we are the generation me. You know, that's the general perception that society has on our group.
Okay, so that's, I think, another very interesting aspect of this conversation about millennials. I think we're called Generation Me, but this is my opinion, right? I think we're called Generation Me because we're so much more aware of our rights, even in terms of legal rights. We're talking about, like if you want to talk about law, since that's sort of the profession I'm in, we are very aware of our rights as opposed to the previous generations in every way. I think even when you look at consumer rights, even when you look at workplace rights, we're all very aware of it. I feel like our previous generation, they were aware of it, but they were never so vocal with it. So I think that's kind of part of the gap that we sense, from baby boomers and millennials. It's because we're so vocal with what's wrong, and we're so quick to realize when something isn't quite right, and we are very verbal with that.
Yeah.
The
And
previous
I think
generation was taught to be quiet about it, I feel. When you look at the 1900s, you look at women. Okay, for instance, look at women during the Jane Austen the Jane Austen era. They were always asked to keep quiet about their rights, but Jane Austen wrote about it, and we still read Jane Austen for a reason, because she was vocal about her rights even during that time. What I'm saying is that climate was different. The young generation of that climate were taught to be quiet.
I think if we're going back, that's even further than the baby boomers, completely further. I think that generation, it was just unacceptable to vocalize things about, even if you go into, feminism and the rights of females, it was just unacceptable to talk about things like that, or perhaps even frowned upon. But I think we have moved into a kind of society where it is now, being in a sense led by the millennials. So it is acceptable and also needed in our current sort of climate that we have now. But to go back a little bit into Generation Me and that term again, I think there are some articles actually online that have mentioned that the reason why we are the Generation Me as well is not entirely because of us as well. It's also because of the way our society has shifted towards a more individualistic society. So, the workforce has become more individualistic, and I guess the requirements of that workforce has made us all slightly more individualistic. And because of that, we are labeled sort of as a Generation Me. But we're going into a workforce that is individualistic. So in a way, it is with reason that we are the Generation Me.
What do you think it has to do with capitalism then?
Everything has to do with capitalism, isn't it?
No, seriously, why is it that you say that we're an individualistic, that Generation Me because we're individualistic? Is it because of how capitalism functions? It's individualistic, but I don't think that's how it is though. Isn't capitalism sort of, the very concept of capitalism isn't really individualistic, is it? It's socialism that's more individualistic, isn't it?
I suppose it is. I think it's what I think about. Again, this is not something that I'm saying, but I do think that this is me trying to
no one's saying anything
trying
now.
to cover my tracks. Yeah. But what I'm trying to say is that I think to a certain degree our job force has become quite individualistic. I think we do work in teams and we work in groups, and we have to obviously learn how to work in groups as well. I think. But I think that the general outcome of our work sort of depends on us as well. Our individualistic sort of revenue and the sort of outcome that we create as individuals.
That's quite different from what I was saying, though. I was saying that, millennials are sort of very aware of their rights and they're sort of very affected by what's going on around them. They're liberals. They think a lot about the issues that are plaguing their nation, the people that are around them. So it's, in a sense, the opposite of being individualistic, isn't it?
I suppose it is, and I guess should we just leave it at that because we have different opinions.
As to what it means to be a millennial,
Yeah,
clearly.
and also society.
So I think it's quite clear that we don't have the same opinion on this. Let's really move on from that.
Yes, let's. And I think we should also mention that this is a very normal occurrence for us, having discussions and oftentimes leaving it at its point because we get into rather huge arguments about it after.
Much like every other millennial. Let's just say that millennials are argumentative, shall we say?
Yes, I think we are argumentative. Let's own up to that.
Okay.
I'm owning up to it. Are you?
Yeah, I am. I am owning up to it.
And let's hope the rest of Malaysia does too.
Okay.
All right. And I think let's move into slightly a more localized topic and perhaps a question that I'm very interested to discuss about, and I think you as well. What is it like to be a millennial in Malaysia? What is it like, Parveen? How would you describe that?
Seeing as Malaysia is a growing nation, I think being a millennial in Malaysia has a kind of hopefulness to it, because there's a hope that perhaps this generation will be the generation to change things, we're sort of the generation that is the future to a degree, and we are sort of living that future, but I think the early aspects of that future, not quite the in-depth future, so to speak. But also when I look at it, we were supposed to be in Vision 2020, the millennials were supposed to be living the dream in a sense, so being a millennial in Malaysia has a different note to it since the pandemic came to be. I think it's had a bit of a tragic note for now. Perhaps that tragicness will change into a more positive note later on.
So would you say that we got the short end of the stick during this pandemic?
We did, to a degree, get the short end of the stick, because this was supposed to be our peak, but it's not really a peak for any sector of society, for any generation now with the pandemic. 2020 was a catastrophic year for everyone, and more so for millennials, because they were just going into the workforce. They were just starting to realize they are sort of starting to become adults in a sense, and it was stolen from them. Just like, children of this generation, their childhood is stolen from them because of the pandemic. So I think the pandemic has really changed what it means to be a millennial. What do you think it means to be a millennial in Malaysia?
I think with a question like this, I would have to reflect a little bit on myself as a millennial and being a Malaysian as well, as a Malaysian millennial, I suppose. And I do agree with you. I think a lot of opportunities have been taken away from every millennial in every country, but I think more so in a developing country like Malaysia. But at the same time, I think on the flip side of it, being a millennial or a Malaysian millennial going through a pandemic, I think it has actually built and also made us stronger in a sense. And I think that is why it becomes important for us now to express our opinions as millennials to sort of get through this pandemic together. What would you say to that, Parveen?
I guess that's a very optimistic way to look at it. I don't know if it's true. I don't believe so. As I said earlier, I'm a bit of a pessimist, or maybe I would like to think, and I've said this to
That
you
you're
before.
a realist?
I'm a realist, yes.
Or an idealist?
No,
Which
I'm
one?
not an idealist. I've never been an idealist. I think I've always been a realist. And I'm looking at it as, these are...
Well, someone has to be an idealist.
Yeah,
Will that make me an idealist?
Yes, it would. You would be the idealist in this dynamic. I'm not the one. When you look at millennials in Malaysia, what it means to be millennials in Malaysia, aside from the whole pandemic millennial, I think it also means that we are a bunch of people who are not so... although there's this whole frame of mind where the older generation always says that it was much more united and it was much more diverse back when, Malaysia first came to be. I actually think millennials are very much an interconnected sort of society. We are aware of our rights in a collective sense. In Malaysia as well, we're very much aware of our rights. And being a young country, I think it's very useful, and it can only mean good things. I think.
Yeah, and I think we are headed towards the right direction as millennials in Malaysia. I think we are uniting. I mean, like you said, and I think it's in different ways. I think the word unity, if you talk about the generations that came before millennials, I think it had a lot to do with race and sort of different ethnicities, which I think is generally the traditional sort of definition of unity. But I think unity now, in our generation, also refers to equality.
Yeah.
Equality with the male, female, equality in opinions, equality in I guess how we perceive people of different age groups as well.
I would look at it a little bit differently. I wouldn't say equality. I would say equity.
Yeah.
Equity. I think that's what the millennials of Malaysia are looking at. We are sort of a society that looks at equity, that looks at rights for everyone, so that everyone is on the same playing field.
Yeah.
So I think that's what it means to be a millennial in Malaysia. It means to be aware of your rights. It means to be optimistic even in times of a
in the
pandemic.
face of adversity.
Yeah, which is a pandemic. It means that when Selangor has a water issue, we are all very open about it. We are all very vocal about it. Whether or not it makes a difference, we don't know. But I think that's really what it means to be a millennial in Malaysia. Maybe let's just move it on a little bit more. It just means to be a human being.
It means to be a human being. That's very philosophical, but I think it sums everything up very nicely. And I that there is a part of my subconscious that feels as though we are completely overselling millennials in this episode. But I think it is a given. I mean, the show is called Millennials Boleh, and it is very optimistic and it is very empowering in a sense. So if we are overselling millennials in this episode, and perhaps in the episodes that come after, I think we are doing it justice. You are doing it
Well,
I hope
this
so.
This is your show.
I don't want to be narcissistic about it, as as we talked about narcissism.
Did we really talk about that?
Well, I think in a sense we did, but
or perhaps that was a conversation that wasn't recorded.
Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps. Again, lots of these things are being lost. We are becoming a little bit confused, but yeah, should we end it on a positive note, Parveen?
Let's end it on a positive note, and perhaps you can give me credit on the name of the show.
Yeah. Well, before we sum up the show and end it on a positive note, on a high note, yes, on a high note. The name of Millennials Boleh actually can be very much credited to the woman standing next to me, or sitting next to me rather.
I don't think we're
sitting next to me.
If we were standing for 20 minutes, we would be possibly. No, actually, that would be quite normal because in school we used to stand for the school assembly. I think that's another thing millennials have in common. That school assembly.
Yes, that united us.
To sit for in public schools.
Yeah, we
stand for. Actually.
We suffered together.
Yeah, we suffered together. We are a generation that suffers together and celebrates together.
And eats together.
Yeah,
together. If we're Malaysians, we definitely eat together.
Yeah.
So millennials eat together. Right. So with that, we're going to end this episode of Millennials Boleh. And we do hope to have lots of healthy discussions in the future on this show. And Parveen, anything that you would like to say before we end the show?
Not really. I think we've sort of said everything about millennials this week. If you ever want me again on your little show, you can always have me on your show. But I think you should bring more people to your show. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about what you're going to do next.
Yeah, and I think in the next episode we would like to go into other issues that affects millennials. And with that is the end of this week's episode, and looking forward to hearing from everyone and their opinions about this episode, and also looking forward to seeing what's in store for the show in the future. All right, bye-bye now.